Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Princeton Public Library's virtual home, where we host author talks. We're so pleased to have you all here with us tonight as we help launch the book of a local author, and it's a special treat for us indeed to be having Mimi Schwartz here and in conversation with Ingrid Reed, and they'll be introducing the book, Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited. As I have put in the chat, this book is available from Labyrinth Books. It's in stock there, and they're offering a 10% discount for the next 2 weeks. You can order it online with the promo code Schwartz, as I've put in the chat, or you can do in-store or curbside pickup by writing to orders@labyrinth.com or by calling their store number, which is also in the chat, and just referencing that you were here with us tonight for the book launch. And we want to thank Labyrinth Books for sponsoring this event with us tonight. It is so great to have a wonderful independent bookstore in our community that is supportive of the library as well as our authors. I'm not going to say much to begin with because we have a lot to cover, and we have with us two women who in this community need very little introduction. So without further ado, I am going to bring up Ingrid and Mimi in just a moment, and we will get officially started with the program. So let me get them on screen. Whoops, okay. Sorry about that. I've got to get them right now. They've been sent requests to unmute themselves and to put their cameras on. There we go. Okay, so here we have Mimi and Ingrid. And with them both here live, I'm going to disappear. I'll be behind the scenes with you all for this event. And Ingrid, take it away.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am so pleased to be here with Mimi Schwartz and introduce my former neighbor, actually a neighbor in two different places, who became my friend. But first, I want to say how proud I am that she has been a professor at Stockton State College and has written 4 books. And I know that she is in demand for workshops all over the place because sometimes we can't even find her. But tonight, it is a special opportunity to introduce the book that you've already heard referenced. I have it right here with all kinds of places marked off. Good Neighbors, Bad Times. And I love the way Revisited is stamped in a kind of very official way. You have to pay attention. So I just want to say that I feel privileged to have had a number of opportunities to connect with Mimi in her long, brave journey to solve a mystery, to question, to understand, to reconcile, to educate, not just for herself. I think there was an element of that, but for everyone, for all of us. And for me personally, as I still struggle with my own family's past in Germany. So Mimi, thank you for your quest and for Good Neighbors, Bad Times Revisited. We look forward to hearing from you and from your book, and that you did not shrink from writing when you thought you had to do it once again. So let's start off. And we agreed that it might be good if you simply showed us some pictures to set the stage and then commented on them so that we have some idea of why you are taking a second look at a very big project that you undertook so successfully. But I don't think you ever stopped thinking about it.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. And I want to thank also Princeton Library and Labyrinth for helping me do this book launch, which actually officially came out March 1st. And thank you, Ingrid, who is a wonderful, patient and creative friend who has launched me, because this is my
we walked a lot.
This is my first Zoom presentation. I've been sitting, I've watched as a recipient of it, but I haven't done it. So thank you, Ingrid, because you were a great help in that. So yeah, the book cover, I think, does tell a way to introduce the book, both why I wrote it to begin with and why it came back 10 years later. So what you're looking at is the a street scene in a little village called Rexingen, which is about 60 kilometers southwest of Stuttgart. And it is in the Schwarzwald, and it is where my father was born in 1898, 30 years before Hitler came to power. And here is what the village looks like now. Janie, maybe. What's unusual about the village is that half of its 1,200 residents when my father was there were Jewish, and the other half were about 95% Catholic and maybe 3 or 4 Protestant families. And what my father used to tell me when I was growing up in Queens, New York, which is where they fled to from Germany in 1937, was that he remembered in his boyhood, what he kept on saying is, in Rexingen, we all got along. Now, I didn't listen very much to that when I was a kid. I was busy trying to be an American girl. But the echoes of those words is what I heard 40 years later when I saw this village Torah. And I saw it in a memorial room in Israel in a village founded by some of the Rexingen Jews fleeing Hitler around the same time that my family was going to the United States. And the old man who showed me around said it had been rescued on Kristallnacht, not by the Jews, but by their Christian neighbors. And that caught my attention because I didn't think of Germans rescuing anything Jewish in those days. And I wondered who did it and why. And those echoes of we all got along seemed to come back to me. And when I went back to Princeton and I started to tell the story of how this Torah had been rescued by the Christians of the village, my friends wanted to know more too. But unfortunately, my father had died, so I couldn't ask him. But when I started asking some of the Rexingen Jews who were still alive and living in New York, I heard my father's echo again, even louder, because they said they hated Germany for betraying them, but they did not hate their next door neighbors. Many were decent people, they remembered. And unlike my father, who was talking about 30 years before Hitler, these memories were from the 1930s during the Third Reich. So now I wondered how much was true, how much was nostalgia for what they wanted to be true. And so I began that first quest on 3 continents to find out about decency as it was remembered by Jewish and Christian villagers who were once good neighbors. So the girl, let's see, going back to the cover,
Right.
the girl here,
Yeah.
who you can see is Hannah, and she's with her cousin, and they did come to New York in the 30s. And when I met her 60 years later, she was an enormous help on this project. She knew everyone, she set me up with everyone, and not only the Jews, but also Christians in the village who she had stayed in touch with. Now, the third figure here, this little boy, is why we visited, as Ingrid says, is stamped on the book, because his name is, maybe you have a little close up of that, Janie, of the boy.
No, I don't think so. Let me try that. I think I got it on the screen.
Yeah, there he is. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
So his name is Max Sayer. He's 5 in the photo, but he's 88 when he wrote me from South Australia, which is where he's lived since he's 21. And he had said that he just read my book and wanted to tell me, and this is actually his words, "Your father was right. We all got along." And it turned out that he had grown up in my father's village, actually 5 houses from where my families had lived for generations, but they never met because his Catholic family had moved in to an abandoned Jewish house in 1937, a few months after my uncle had sold our family house and fled Germany. So I answered the letter, curious, and found out that he had written a memoir for his Australian family about growing up during the Third Reich, beginning in 1935 when he was 5, the age of the picture, and ending at the war's end in 45 when he was 15. And he shares it with me, and I hear our village stories talking to each other as if out of different windows of history. Here is a young Catholic boy's perspective. Everyone else was 10 or 20 years older in those days. Here's a family that did not self-identify as friends of the Jews as the others did. And here is a private memoir written for family, not for public consumption, and not oral histories like those that I had been told with my tape recorder running. So what to make this family that no one had mentioned as a good neighbor? Here they are in 1934. Max is to the right in the back. How did they fit in or not into my existing story? And that was my new quest.
Well, Mimi, now that you've given us this introduction, it would really be interesting to hear, have you read from your book a couple of sections where you captured the people that we've talked about and let them speak for themselves. So could you find the section of where you were interviewed someone on your first trip, and then maybe read from one of the exchanges between you and Max?
That sounds good. So what I would like to do is to read 2 excerpts about how the sense of trust in the village where everyone once got along began to break down, and how it really collapsed after Kristallnacht in November 1938, which is the night when the Germans systematically tried to burn as many synagogues in Germany as possible. So the first one is from Lottie, one of the Jews I wrote about in my 2008 book. And the second is from Max and comes from his memoir that he sent me 2 years ago. And so let me introduce Lottie first. Oh, keep going. There we are.
Here she is.
So Lottie is on the left is a 13-year-old with her little cousins, I think they are, and they called her Stumpela at the time. And I think I can see that name might have held then, but if you look at her when I met her on the right, holding her granddaughter, and she's now in Riverdale, New York, she is no longer a Stumpela. So anyway, in this excerpt I'm going to read, she's recalling both the pleasures and the terrors that she had in the years before she left in 1939. So this is Lottie talking. Lottie talks of how she used to climb up in the meadow on the hill to pick flowers, lie in the sun, and listen to the sounds of the village. It was so wonderful. I'd hear voices from the village, and the sound of the anvil and the smithy made such a wonderful sound that would echo in my ears. The crowing, the mooing of the cows, and the sense of belonging, that this was my place. And then she talks of the Nazi festivities that were held under the swastika mounted on that same hill. They would congregate under it at night and make a huge fire. You'd hear crowds yelling, torches swaying. It was very frightening to us. And they'd sing Nazi songs and shout anti-Semitic propaganda. Did you know the people who went to those bonfires, I asked? Were they out-of-towners or from Rexingen? Some were Rexingeners. There was one, the son of the letter carrier, and the father wanted nothing to do with him. Another family nearby was also Nazi, but most of our neighbors were very supportive of the Jews. Everyone said it couldn't last forever. The Allies wouldn't permit it. The Nazi government will fall and everything will be like before. She smiles. You can't minimize the illusions that people live under. The illusions were nurtured, she said, not only by optimistic neighbors, but also by the fear of starting new somewhere else, of not having enough money to leave, of having an old parent who wouldn't be able to get a visa. The illusions lasted until the day after Kristallnacht. Only then did neighbors no longer dare to say hello in public, and children began to throw stones more openly, even though their parents disapproved. And the constant barrage of anti-Semitic propaganda had its effect. When you're pounded with how terrible these Jews are, even I, after a while, began to feel like a bad person. Even in 1939, right before Lottie left on the last boat to leave Germany before the war, memoirs of bad are overpowered by good, and the image of the Nazi bonfires do not undermine her belief in communal decency prevailing over random violence. The Rexingeners, you know, were not animals, she insists. That wouldn't go in our village. They didn't beat up anybody or harm anybody. Even if they arrested someone, they were civil. You couldn't just beat up anybody because you felt like beating up. There was a code still maintained, a code of civility. Was that true in all the small villages, I asked? Lottie didn't know for sure. Many did not have so many Jews, she said. You know, they were half our village once. So that was Lottie. And that is the name I used in the book, incidentally. Her real name, I think her daughter might be on and would like me to say it, is Helen Gribbets. And I also in this book used, from the first edition, I used the real name of the village, which is Rexingen. Those of you who know the first book know that I used Benheim there, but I used Rexingen because the villagers had posted the first book on their website. So I figured there was no reason to not use the real name, even though using pseudonyms is actually in the tradition of writing about small villages to protect the anonymity of the people who were in it, who were neither, weren't terrible people, so may not want the privacy. But anyway, it is Rexingen, and it is Helen, not Lottie, but it's Lottie in my book.
So that you really captured the scene of what it must have been before, and then the terror that was actually visited to the village outside of their control. So now should we hear what Max has to say about this?
Yes, let's do that. So here is Max. Maybe we can find him. I'd like to introduce him visually too. Here is Max. He is 8 on the left, which is how old he was around the time of Kristallnacht and the time of this memory, which I'm going to read. He's maybe 5 years younger than Lottie or Helen was. And here he is with his wife, Bernie, in Australia when we began to correspond 2 years ago. And this excerpt that I'm going to read is one of about 20 that are in the book, talking to the earlier stories. They're scattered throughout the book. Max's words. Kristallnacht brought about a very different way of life. Most Christians being ashamed of what happened, the Jews not trusting us anymore. They stayed in their houses most of the time, and they were made to wear the Star of David on their clothes when they appeared in public. Their businesses had to display signs stating that inside is a Jewish business. The Nazis glued placards on those houses urging Germans don't buy in Jewish businesses, which of course the Jewish owners weren't brave enough to remove. I was always told to treat Jews the same as everybody else, but that estranged feeling stayed in me. I used to feel uneasy when I met Jews on the road. Some of our Jewish neighbors also showed their annoyance at us. They weren't many friendly smiles anymore. I suppose they didn't know what they did wrong to be treated like this. They had lived their lives as they were brought up, and that never hurt any Christians in Rexingen. Every now and then, one or two families disappeared. They would go across the Swiss border and then to Portugal, and from there to America or England. And then 2 or 3 months later, after they left Rexingen, somebody heard that they were in London or in America. Further down in the street, there lived a couple of girls about my age, and this was their plight. When I heard about it, I felt sorry for them, as I knew they couldn't speak English. And I said to Mom, but they can't talk to anybody. And Mom said, they can't speak to anybody here either. And what I love about these memories is the way that they let you into the world as someone else experiences it. And it is a world, and if it's a world that you think you know and you don't, so much the better. And that for me is the power of memoir, to turn one-dimensional stereotypes of the Jewish neighbor, the German neighbor, into three-dimensional people. And that power is also why, and I just realized this recently, why I think Max and his family wrote me 2 years ago, because the Jews were not spoken about. Max's children told me, not at home, and not when they went back to Rexingen, which they would do from Australia to visit their grandparents, and they'd walk past the former Jewish synagogue and the old Jewish cemetery in the woods, and all was silent. There were no stories. But when they read passages like Lottie's, they entered into her world, and that filled a void. And maybe a similar void that I felt when I was reading Max's memoir and felt like I was reading things that I hadn't heard before, hadn't experienced before through his eyes.
And to think that they were both neighbors. I mean, they were neighbors in their own neighborhood at the time, but they could have been neighbors so close. And would they have walked by each other, or would they have spoken to each other? It's interesting to think.
Well, the story goes on and on. I probably will find out something like that one of these days, that they may well have known each other.
Right. Well, the whole word neighbor, or the concept of neighbor and neighborhood, is so central to what you write about. And it turns out that it's sort of central to our adulthood. When you repeated neighbors in the title, every once in a while, I wondered if there would be a punctuation point of where you might say, put a question mark in good neighbors, but you didn't lead us in that direction. But I thought it'd be interesting to explore what we in our formative adult years experienced as neighbor and neighborhood, and ask you to reflect if that had something to do with your interest in returning to Rexingen and looking at that from a neighbor's point of view. We were fortunate to live among good neighbors as young mothers in a deliberately integrated neighborhood right near in Princeton. And for me, growing up, it was growing up in South Jersey, it was very pleasant there, and it was very diverse and agriculture town. But my family, as Protestant German immigrants, were actually in the minority. For me, coming to that special neighborhood, which is pictured here, I first realized how intentional kindness and helpfulness was among both the children and the adults, and that's at Glen Acres. that sort of redefined my thinking of neighborhood beyond the way we think of neighborhoods having boundaries, street boundaries, a certain section and so on. And it was such a respectful relationship that you could count on. So, I mean, what did you make of that experience that we shared? We haven't really talked about it very much as adults. We certainly got to learn a lot about being mothers and running houses. But did you think that sort of shaped your thinking about the concept of good neighbors?
I do. And it's actually something that I only really realized after I had finished the book, is that I think the idea of we all got along, I knew that in the gut from living in my time in Glen Acres, because when I grew up, which was in Forest Hills, Queens, there were no good neighbors. There was no neighborhood, no sense of neighborhood. We knew maybe two people. So when I came to Glen Acres, was my first house, and I one second, I'm good. It was my first house, and we knew nothing about owning a house. And Don and Ruth Moore, who lived in the same house as us, 3 houses down, knew everything about houses. So they were always helping us out. And they were the first African-American family that I had gotten to really know in the 24 years that I aged when I was there. And along with Cecilia Hodges, who lived across the street and who has stayed in my life most recently as a fellow ensemble member in Onstage Seniors, which is a documentary theater group that we're both in. But that neighborhood made those connections possible. And I think that going back to how I thought it was connected to Rexingen is that in the village, as well as in Glen Acres, the two groups who had very different life histories, very different cultures, really made a concerted effort to be good neighbors. And in Glen Acres, it has continued to succeed. We lived there in the 60s, both you and I, and it's still succeeding to this day as a place in which people bring very different cultures together and are managing to make it work, because I think the image of the kids all playing in the field together every day from 15 houses and just having a good time. We did not have anything like that certainly when I was growing up.
And it was an example of what you could have in a neighborhood, I guess, and wondered if that was really, if you could ask the Retzigen neighbors how they felt about it. They might hear some of the same things about trust and knowing something about others. But you spent a lot of time interviewing people and in New York and going back and getting translators, as I remember, and checking with people and so on. But I think it would be interesting to hear about when you thought you were nearly finished with the project at the first book. And I think probably had sort of settled in and maybe said, well, now I've done it, I'm going to finish it up. Something happened. You got an invitation, and you had to decide whether or not you did want to return. And for a very special occasion that I think you had some misgivings about, if I read it right. So could you take us into that activity, that incident, that effort that you made to go back, and why?
Sure. Well, it's funny. I was trying to end the book, and I really didn't know how, because you could keep getting stories and stories. And so this invitation came from the mayor. I think we have a picture of him. and he's the one in the blue shirt, and he's with two other people. And the three of them spearheaded this restoration project, which was to restore what was the synagogue and became the Protestant Evangelical Church in 1953, and to make that restoration a way to both honor Jewish history and have it be a memorial in a way that in which people every Sunday came and it was part of it. So I was a little bit ambivalent about how all that was going to work, because it was the synagogue and now it was the church. But I decided that I would go. And the invitation, incidentally, from the mayor, who I had known before, was, "Dear Frau Professor Schwartz, it is my pleasure to announce that the interior sanctuary of the former synagogue is close to completion after long construction and renovation. On June 15th, we want to celebrate and invite you to the celebration." So that's how they saw it. "We know it's a long trip, but we would be delighted if you could come." And so I decided to go. And I realized when I was there that all the complexities of the village story were not only in this reconstruction issue of the former synagogue that's now the church, but also in my efforts to tell the story. And I get some discoveries in the process that I think is captured, Ingrid, in this excerpt that you had asked me if I would read. So to set the stage, maybe the next shows the beginning of the people who were gathering for this all-day celebration, and they were coming from all over the Schwarzwald. There were some people from Israel. There were some people from Frankfurt. There were people, I came from New York, and I think a couple of other people did too. And so this is the beginning of this gathering, and this is a description of what happened to me in the process of the morning of this day. "We are downstairs below the sanctuary in the meeting room, packed with people. The mayor is welcoming everyone who had supported the restoration of the synagogue. Thank you all for having made this day possible. The choir of Horp, the bakers of all the cakes waiting upstairs. He is a fine man, with a little less hair than when we first met 5 years ago, but with the same energy and ability to make people believe that good things can be done. Today's turnout is proof. Across from him, I see the mural of Jesus, Moses, and Elijah is still here. Why did I think it would be gone? I found out its inscriptions, Matthew 17, 1-8, tells how Peter and the disciples were ready to make shelters for all three prophets. But then the Lord appeared as bright cloud and said, "This is my son, my beloved, on whom my favor rests. Listen to him." I turn away. But the Germans, a Christian Scientist, a Protestant, and a Catholic, all defend the mural's good intentions. The artist, they assure me, is part of an art movement famous for being anti-Nazi. I still hate it. It is where the rescued Torah once was. And today we have some very special visitors, the mayor drones. The cantor from Stuttgart, applause. The director of Jewish Affairs in Württemberg, applause. The Schwabian band, applause. And suddenly I hear my name, that I have come all this way from America, the daughter of a Rexian Jew, and that I will speak. Did you know that? Whispers Carol, my translator. I shake my head, no. My husband pokes me in the ribs. Will you translate for me? I ask Carol, frantic about what I will say. That this is a day of celebration, that this is a day that there is nothing to celebrate, that there's a good spirit here, that I feel a great loss here. But let me read letters from all the well-wishers. The mayor reads letters from congratulations from the Jews from New York and from those who settled in the little village in Rexingen, where I first saw the Torah. And then other speeches begin. Let's learn from the past and never forget it. Let this building support the Jewish-Christian dialogue and the communication of all religions. Let this building serve as a reminder to all that never again can we allow any form of racial or despicable acts of humankind. Good words. I make myself stop looking at the mural and start looking at the faces around me. They are benign, smiling, with no scowls in sight. There are many I know and don't know, the 6 nuns, the young mothers with strollers listening intently to the mayor's words and the reconciliation they promise. These are the kind of people my father and the Jews in New York remember. Good people with good spirit. If only collectively they had been more powerful. If only the building could make and keep them so. And now our speaker, a daughter from Rexingen, the mayor says, and I go with Carol to the podium, the mural at my back, to tell everyone how my father, before the Hitler years, had always felt a good spirit in Rexingen. And I feel it here today.
And I think you still sort of feel it here today, but you couldn't end there, Mimi. Max came along, right?
Exactly.
So you introduced us to Max and described the beginning of your connection with him and his family. And I think it is at this point that we should leave it to the reader of Revisited to follow how that relationship evolved and experience what you experienced. So let's skip to the end of the book, where you describe your year-long relationship with Max and his family through emails culminating in this final online meeting, where after talking for an hour, you asked them a final question, or you thought it would be a final question. So would you read that short passage? And then I'm going to play the voice of Maxwell, the son, who responds to you. The short introduction.
On our Skype call, I asked the family, do you see similarities between Nazi times and today? At first there was silence and I thought I had stepped on a third rail, but within a week, both brothers wrote me answers. Bernard lamented, and Bernard incidentally is in the lower left of this picture. Bernard lamented that unlike the Rexingen he so often visited, we only think of ourselves today, not of our community. And Max, who is in the lower right, sends me a very long and thoughtful letter. And I think, Ingrid, it spoke to you especially, so you wanted to.
Well, you know, Mimi, it speaks to you. And
well, it does speak to me, yes.
And so I wanted to have it in Maxwell's voice.
Okay.
Okay. Dear Mimi, every day we read of acts of violence or hatred based on religion or race somewhere in the world, and we realize that the world hasn't learned from the lessons of the past, and we despair that more tolerance and respect isn't being shown. Violence only brings more hatred. And then he turns a little reflective. I feel a little embarrassed sometimes that we speak to you about Rexingen and its community being so special to us. It is, of course, a loved place to us and forever close in our hearts. But we, my father excepted, have only known it in times of peace. The truth is, we could never imagine it as it must have been for the Jewish people in the time of the Nazis. And I'd understand if you felt us to be insensitive when we talk of Rexingen and its community in such glowing terms. With such terrible injustices being carried out against the Jewish people in those times, I can understand your father's reluctance to stay overnight on German soil when he brought you back to Rexingen in the 1950s. I am truly saddened at the horrific injustices that were inflicted on the Jews, and I can only hope that the stories of some of the Christians doing what they could has in some small way helped you comprehending what went on, even in Retzigen. My mother recalled a story this morning of brothers who had fixed Jewish windows only to be sent away to the front a week later, never to return. On reflecting on those terrible times, I am often reminded of the saying, evil prevails when good men do nothing. But I'm also horrified at the punishments handed out to those people who acted with bravery, humanity, and common decency. And here's a little pleading for understanding. Our family isn't perfect, but we were very grateful for your book. It provided us with stories about our beloved Retzigen, but it taught us so much more by reminding us as how important it is in all societies around the world to guard against extremism in all its forms and hatred from wherever it appears. It reminds us of how we need to build societies based on respect, tolerance, and love. Now, it didn't end there. In your book, you comment that another email arrived. And he says, I visited my auntie in Adelaide yesterday. She is the oldest of Dad's sisters and came to Australia in 1954. She recalled how the Jewish cemetery was sadly vandalized during the war. She said that it was schoolboys, probably around Dad's age, who were doing it. She said that her father, my grandfather, bluntly warned my father one day, if you set foot up there with those boys, then don't bother coming back home again. Those were the boys that Lottie remembered setting the fires and frightening and dooming them. So that is the way the communication with Maxilla ended. And then there's one final line in the book, and it's you saying, finished is a word I must stop using. So great book. I have all these places that I want to read again, and enjoyed hearing your voice, bringing voice to people who I think we're all neighbors in some way or another, and we're all living in a very troubling world. So it's good to hear your voice and many other voices that you've brought to us to make us at least reflect what we can do. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Ingrid. And I think Maxilla said it all in that last part in terms of the connections between what we can take from the past and hopefully bring to today. To I was thinking of Biden, President Biden in his speech saying, we can stop being adversaries and try to be neighbors to, in the good sense of the word. And I think that definitely has happened with the Sayer family and me over the last 2 years. So.
Do we have time for some questions for Mimi? I think, Janie, where are you? You were going to look and see.
Yep, I'm here behind the scenes.
Okay.
We certainly do have time for some questions.
Okay.
And I think we can answer them live here on air. So there's a question here from Christina who says, thank you so much. And she is wondering how close the revisited version is to the original. Clearly, it was wonderful to be able to include Max. But so how much is it to the original?
So pretty much I left the original intact, and Max's excerpts are in between chapters with my connection as to how I heard the voices speaking to the voices in the book. So it's kind of a memoir with two memoirs speaking to each other, basically, in conversation. And then both the beginning of the book tells the story of how we met and why it seemed to me to that I needed to revisit the village to tell the stories that were still in the shadows from the first time when I had looked. Mostly my goal was to investigate decency. So I had avoided the Nazis and anyone who wasn't in this little clique of people who were remembered as Jews, but as friends of the Jews. But and then the last part, there's another long chapter, which is about what happened, how this letter developed, where we became virtual neighbors, helping each other, interacting with each other, and eventually meeting on Skype and Zoom, which incidentally on my website, there is a video if you want to see some of this meeting. My daughter, Julie, who's a videographer, put it together. So she captured some of that, and it is on my website for those who want to see it.
Okay. So someone here has just mentioned again, when you said it, that they were going to bring up how Biden used the word neighbor in this way as well, and that a society that would protect our neighbors, and that this is a great program, very moving and necessary. And we've had a lot of comments there from people how this has been an amazing program for them. So thank you. So someone else saying they read the first edition. I'm just seeing if we have questions. We have another question over here in the Q&A. Let's go back to that. Elliot Daly says that they were stunned by your description of the rapidity with which the wall went up between the Jews and the others, their neighbors. Hours and days, not months and years. How do you understand the forces that accelerated the enmity or distancing?
Well, I think it was both sudden and gradual at the same time, because for years, from say 1931 until Kristallnacht, gradually the Jews felt more and more uncomfortable in the village, where there wasn't a lot of violence, as you know, the Lottie and had said. People were told, no, don't worry about it, it's going to blow over. So it was gradual, but it was happening. And then Kristallnacht in 1938, as she says, it was impossible to have the illusion that things were going to be okay. And one of the other people I interviewed said it was the 9/11 for the Jews, that they knew they had to leave. And ironically, the story of Lottie, her father, who had been a soldier in World War I and was decorated and really did believe that things were going to blow over and it would be fine, refused to even think about leaving. And her mother, her mother secretly got visas so that after Kristallnacht, they were able to make that last boat before the war started. And I should say, which I didn't say, is that of the in the 1930s, there 350 Jews were in the village, and that were able to, that left. No, about 2/3 of those did leave and found other places to start their lives. 87 of the Jews born in Rexingen did not make it, were deported, and only 2 survived the camps, and the rest did die, were murdered.
Mimi, I remember reading different statements or different people that you talked with and so on. They had a lot of faith in the Allies coming in and taking care of this. They really didn't think that Germany, that the Nazis would prevail. And I thought that was very interesting to hear them in effect characterize us in that way. But it turned out to be a much more difficult thing, or maybe we also didn't make some of the choices that would have made that possible.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just wondering, this is going to be going up on the library's YouTube channel and it'll get shared widely. And I know here tonight, we have some people from out of state or out of the Princeton area on the call with us, even some from Germany. But you know, you talked a little bit about the West Windsor neighborhood that you grew up in, Glen Acres. Maybe Ingrid or Mimi, you can tell us a little bit more about that, because there might not be people understand how unique that neighborhood was at the time and how it came to be, how Glen Acres came to be.
Well, it actually is partly a Princeton story and partly the vision of a developer who built houses just like a lot of developers did after the war. But he felt that there was so much discrimination against Blacks moving into suburban neighborhoods that one of the ways of making for a fairer experience was to build neighborhoods in which smaller neighborhood in which 2/3 of the buyers would be white and 1/3 would be Black, and that each would agree to sell only to a Black or a white person. And through the Nassau Presbyterian Church, I think money was raised and help was given to identify places where this kind of development could take place. One was in the center of, I would say, the suburban part of the township. I think it was called Maple Crest, and I'm not so knowledgeable about that. The other was a plot of land where a developer had started and built 4 houses right on Alexander Road before you reached Route 1 on your right. And that's where we lived and bought the houses and had this experience of neighborliness that is hard to explain, except that we lived it, right? Mimi, can you want to add to that?
Yeah, first of all, it was an area in and of itself. It was surrounded by these wonderful fields that the kids could run free. And it was the Maple Crest, which was in Princeton, was more part of, had the less defined external boundaries because it just spilled over into other neighborhoods. But we felt, I think, in Glen Acres that it was us. We were there in a little village. So in that sense, it had boundaries around it. And I think that made for a kind of cohesiveness or caring or an sense of being in its own, having its own identity that made it special and that people really cared about it.
Yeah. It was, if you people want to just go Googling around Glen Acres, New Jersey, Princeton area, there was a documentary about it. There's a lot written about it. It's a very unique neighborhood, and it was it's such a wonderful that all these years later, obviously it was a good neighborhood, because the good neighbors are still friends here talking live for us on Zoom tonight for the library. Mimi, your granddaughter Carly has got a question for us.
I see.
Wow, how nice.
And she wants to know how young people today can be good neighbors in what is a society that has strife and hatred.
Ah, that's a toughie.
That's a smart granddaughter.
I think it has to do with, I think we're a society that demonizes each other. Ingrid and I were talking about, what does it mean to be a good neighbor if you have a Black Lives Matter sign on one lawn and your neighbor has a Trump sign on the other? How do you find places to connect? And I think what I learned with this whole 2 years with Max is that finding common ground is not so much even trying to convince someone of their politics. It's finding common humanity, and from there you can maybe move forward and get beyond the issues that separate you once you build up a kind of trust in being able to interact as people. And I think that we need to do more of that. We need to think of each other as people and listen more, and hopefully be able to turn lower the temperature, as President Biden said.
Yes, but Patricia Higgins just put a quote into the chat that's really good. She says, the idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong with the world. And it's a quote from Paul Farmer. And I think that is, something that we are living through right now. We had a question here, and we have two more questions, and then I think we're going to wrap it up. Just someone wanting to know, are there any Jewish people living in the village now in Germany? In
Rexingen. Yeah, that's very interesting. There was, when I started this project, which was in the late 80s, early 90s, there was no Jews living there. There is one Jewish family there now, as far as I know. But what's interesting about this village, and there's a lot about that in the book too, is that 1/3 of the village is now Muslim, and a lot of Kurds and Afghans and Turkish, a lot of Turks moved into the Jewish houses, and so that now, it still is a village in which people are trying to get along. And so one story, I went around one day with a journalist who covered the town meetings in all these little towns around in this particular area of the Schwarzwald. And she had said to me, in Rexingen, they're always still trying to make it work, trying to figure out how to make it work, as opposed to this town about 4 kilometers away, which they have been fighting for 400 years. There are these warring families that have been fighting, and the atmosphere continues to be the same in town halls. And it struck me that there are two kinds of places. There are places where people make the commitment to get along and it works, and there are places where people are always fighting with each other. And so Rexingen, I think, continues to try to make that effort as best they can.
Okay, and then our final question, and I'm not sure, this is, just on your experience, Mimi, that Tom Larson wants to know. He says that all his Jewish friends in America tend to be non-practicing. And is this true of the Jews that live in Germany today? And I'm not sure there's that too many to begin with, but then also, what about Catholics and Protestants in Germany? Did you find them to be less religious or more religious than in the US?
As far as the Jews I can't speak for beyond what I know. I know the Jews who were in Rexingen before Hitler were traditional. They weren't they were kosher, and that was a big part of how the town functioned together, that people would have drinks together, beer in the Jewish Gasthaus, but they wouldn't eat in each other's homes because the Jews were kosher. So there was that. Again, there was differences that they were respected as such. As far as the Germans I know, I don't feel comfortable, I think, trying to generalize. I think the Germans that I've met seem to be not as religious as in the States, or the people who are Catholic and Protestant in the States that I know. But I don't feel comfortable really.
Mimi, it's hard to say anything about percentages, but when we did take that trip to Germany in '99,
Right.
There was enough talk about Russian immigrants who were Jewish, sort of building a culture where there were some synagogues. And in some of the larger cities in Germany, there are actually new, attractive, modern synagogues that have been built. But it's hard, as you say, you can't, what can you really say about that? What percentage is it and so on? But it seemed to me that in small ways, the Jewish culture or religion was taking place in more urban places in Germany.
Yeah, I think the Jews that have come to live in Germany, especially from, as you said, Russia and Eastern Europe, are more religious, and they have built new synagogues. So yes, I think you're right about that in, say, in Frankfurt, and even in some of the larger towns near Rexingen, where I've gone to, they have built synagogues again as a way. But that's a different. It was a different group of Jews who came in. That certainly the Jews who lived there, some returned, and I don't know much about how religious they are. You know.
Okay, so I'm back here again with you on the screen, and we're coming up on the top of the hour, and it's been such a fascinating hour. And I want to thank Ingrid for doing a great job with the interview, and it's been really fun to work with you both. And Mimi, thanks for revisiting this story and giving it fresh eyes. But also, I feel that this story is just so timely for today's times that we're living through here in the United States, which are more divisive than ever. And to revisit the concept of what it means to be a good neighbor in what is actually some pretty bad times. And I hope that will inspire us all. And again, just for anybody who joined in late, if you go back to the top of the chat, our local independent bookstore, Labyrinth Books, is carrying Mimi's book and will give you 10% off. But it's also available, I believe, on Amazon and other places. But I always encourage you to support local. And we'll be having copies in the Princeton Public Library as well, if you want to check it out and read it from there. So yeah, this is signing off from Princeton Library and Labyrinth Books, and hope we'll see you at future author events. We have some great events coming up for Women's History Month. If you go to our website, princetonlibrary.org, you'll see a banner there that will click you right through. We're especially excited at the end of the month that we will have Kate Quinn and Lauren Willig with us to discuss. Lauren has a new book out about World War I. It's a fictionalized account of the Smith College women unit that went over to the front lines of France, and we're a rescue unit and worked right along the front lines. And it's based upon the archives of the research that she did at Smith College. And then Kate Quinn's book is called The Rose Code, and it's set in London, and it's the story of some of the code breakers at Bletchley Park and their work there, and again, based on research. So fiction books that I've read them both, they're wonderful. I'm going to have these two wonderful, well-known fiction authors talking about women during World War I and World War II. So, but we have lots of other events coming up. So check out our website. And again, thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Mimi, and we will see everybody again soon at the Princeton Public Library.
Congratulations, Mimi.
Thank you. Thank you all.